que sea serio y que diga la verdad. Ellos cayeron.
Right now, Venezuela is on the verge of another revolution. The country was gripped by mass protests after the elections, but this is only the tip of all the problems of the state. Just think about it. Venezuela is a country with the largest oil reserves and at the same time, one of the most backward economies. 20% of all world reserves belong to this state, which is even more than that of Saudi Arabia. 298 billion barrels is Venezuela's black wealth, and at the same time, its curse. But just a few decades ago, Venezuela was flourishing. People were awash in money, and industrialization was in full swing. But how is this possible? And why is too much money spent incorrectly so much worse than not having it? The answer to all these questions lies in this black substance. Just imagine, in a modest agrarian country with a poorly developed economy, oil is suddenly found. And this event dramatically changes the fate of the entire state. In 1917, commercial oil production from the fields of the Maracaibo Basin began in Venezuela. And there is so much money in the country, more than Venezuelans have ever seen. The First World War, the Second World War, the Reconstruction period, literally everyone needed oil. And it so coincidentally happened that huge reserves of this resource were found in Venezuela. The oil boom made Venezuelan society more modern. A middle class was formed there, people began to move to cities, and the state actively implemented state programs. Take a look at this graph. In 1950, when the rest of the world was trying to recover from the effects of World War II, Venezuela ranked 4th in terms of GDP per capita. The indicator was 2 times higher than that of Chile, 4 times higher than in Japan, and 12 times higher than in China. Now it looks just incredible. But this success did not last long. Do you know these stories about huge lottery winnings? When people receive millions, it would seem that their lives should get better. But on the contrary, people often slip into even greater poverty and lose everything. In a sense, the history of Venezuela is very similar to these cases. Already in the 1980s, the country's population began to rapidly become poorer. The overproduction of oil simply destroyed the country's economy, which no longer had anything to rely on. Oil prices collapsed, and state revenues collapsed with them. Inflation jumped to unprecedented levels, 84.5% in 1989, and then 99.9% in 1996. And in order to not wallow in poverty at all, the government began to print more money, which of course increased inflation even more. Then at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a slight rise because oil prices stabilized. It's time to learn from your own mistakes and diversify the economy. In 2014, the price per barrel fell again from $100 to $50, and then to $40. And such a sharp reduction by more than half has weakened the Venezuelan economy again. Just imagine how much this has affected the standard of living. By 2017, 93% of the country's population complained of malnutrition. As you understand, agriculture did not develop in the country because all attention was again directed to the oil-producing sector, and the reforms only worsened the food market. On November 1st, 2017, President Nicolas Maduro announced the introduction of a 100,000 bolivar banknote. Imagine, people went to the grocery store with 100,000 bills. And of course, these endless zeros only complicated the money turnover. And in 2018, hyperinflation became simply incomprehensible. 130,000% according to the Central Bank of Venezuela, and according to the calculations of the National Assembly, even more. 1,370,000%. In these photos, you can see how much money was needed to buy basic products in Venezuela in 2018. These pictures were taken by Reuters news agency journalist Carlos Garcia Rollins, and the footage is truly impressive. To buy 1 roll of toilet paper, Venezuelans had to spend 2.6 million bolivars. The Venezuelan authorities have twice carried out the denomination of the local currency and removed as many as 6 zeros from banknotes. Yes, it became a little more convenient to pay, but of course, this did not save the situation in the economy. The bolivar continues to depreciate rapidly. And this is what the change in the exchange rate of the bolivar against the dollar looks like over the past 12 months. An uncompromising decline. It is not surprising that Venezuelan citizens are so eager for a change of power that they are even ready to go out to mass protests. So what is happening in this country now? On July 28th, presidential elections were held there. According to the Electoral Council, Nicolas Maduro won 51% of the vote and entered his third presidential term. After that, protests immediately broke out in Venezuela. The people were convinced that the elections were rigged. Clashes broke out in Caracas between police and demonstrators, who began throwing stones and Molotov cocktails at law enforcement officers. More than 190 people have already been injured and 27 have died, and half of them are police and military. To which Maduro confidently responds, the Wall Street Journal reported that the United States is offering Maduro to relinquish power, in return for which they are ready to drop charges of drug terrorism against him. Yes, there was such a situation in this whole story. Do you remember? In 2020, the US Department of Justice accused Nicolas Maduro and 14 other Venezuelan officials of drug terrorism, corruption, and drug trafficking. They claimed that Maduro was cooperating with the Colombian group Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia to flood the United States with cocaine and undermine the health and well-being of the American nation. This is a quote from a speech by U.S. Attorney General William Barr. Moreover, Washington was ready to pay $15 million for information that would help arrest the Venezuelan president. Apparently, they didn't have enough evidence. And what now? The United States is ready to forget about everything and drop the charges as soon as Maduro leaves office. Probably this is also for the sake of the welfare of the American nation. However, one question arises. Why is the United States so actively worried about what is happening in Venezuela now? And here, we should recall one key character in the history of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. During his reign from 1999 to 2013, the country took the path of abandoning its orientation towards the United States. At that time, the rearmament of the army with Russian weapons was organized, and the course for a multipolar world was economically set. Yes, of course, the scale of statements about multipolarity is not comparable to what the BRICS countries are broadcasting now. Venezuela just wanted to make more profitable and safe oil trading conditions for itself because it still remained the main pillar of their economy. But the United States, as a rule, does not like such a policy very much. It would be much more profitable for the United States if countries rich in natural resources supplied them with these resources on the most favorable terms, rather than striving to develop their economies. That is, they would become raw material appendage for developed countries. And even the history of oil production in Venezuela is proof of that. As is often the case in such countries, oil production there was initiated by the United Kingdom. The first well was opened under the leadership of the British oil and gas company, Royal Dutch Shell. And later, the Americans and their notorious Standard Oil Corporation joined the fields. And you know what? Venezuela has not only the largest oil reserves, but also very convenient outlets to the sea to deliver this oil to the same America. And of course, the United States initially made sure that the conditions of production and supply were as favorable as possible for them. Therefore, the idea of a multipolar world, extensive trade opportunities for Venezuela, and their other aspirations were negatively perceived by the United States. In 2016, Venezuela's economy hit rock bottom again due to lower oil prices. The economic crisis turned into a political one, and harsh sanctions from America began with the freezing of assets, a ban on technology transfer, and access to banking resources. But the biggest damage to the republic's economy was caused by the 2019 sanctions against the state oil and gas company Petróleos de Venezuela. According to some reports, Venezuela has lost more than $232 billion due to U.S. sanctions against the oil and gas industry. The total losses of the economy are estimated at $642 billion US dollars. And about $30 billion more is frozen in Western banks. The country is still feeling the sanctions' consequences. But let's remember that Venezuela is still the richest country in oil deposits. According to the latest calculations, this is 298 billion barrels. To make you understand how much this is, let's compare. Prosperous Saudi Arabia has 266 billion, Iran has 157 billion, Iraq has 148 billion barrels, and Kuwait has 100 billion. This begs the question, what is wrong with this country? Why can't they turn their natural resources into a thriving economy? The first reason that everyone refers to is that the country has been seized by the oil curse. That is, the Venezuelan economy is too focused on oil production, which means it is dependent on its course. So far, 95% of Venezuela's total export revenues come from the oil sector. The slightest fluctuations in oil prices immediately undermine the Venezuelan economy, and there can be no question of stability. And this has been the case for almost the entire history of their oil production, regardless of who held the post of president. Most often, when a country's economy is tied to one resource, the government tries to strengthen control over it and nationalize the main source of its income so that all the money goes to the treasury. Venezuela has followed exactly this path. But when all the main enterprises are state-owned, there is no competition, which means the economy is not developing, and the country naturally comes to dictatorship. In 1976, the Venezuelan government decided to strengthen control over oil production in the country and created the local oil company Petroleos de Venezuela, the one that the United States will then impose sanctions on. Exploration, production, refining, and oil experts were all now under government control. And yes, the country began to receive more money from oil. But because of such profitability, the authorities often forget about other important industries. The oil industry flourished, but industry and agriculture, on the contrary, declined. And how do you think it could have been otherwise? Countries that nationalize the main source of income often come to autocracy because it is the most convenient way to control the flow of funds. And they also often get hooked on the oil needle without developing other sectors of the economy. But not all resource-rich countries have such a situation. For example, Saudi Arabia. Their economy is also directly dependent on the oil sector. But unlike Venezuela, they spend their oil revenues much more wisely. Firstly, although Venezuela has more oil reserves, in terms of exports, it is only in 8th place, and Saudi Arabia is confidently holding the first position. According to economist Daniel Lacalle, Venezuela's oil reserves mainly consist of super heavy crude oil, the production of which may be unprofitable under certain market conditions, and Saudi oil is of high quality and affordable. Secondly, the Saudis understand that oil well-being is not reliable enough, so they invest in other industries. They are developing technologies and education, building infrastructure. The country spends billions on projects to develop alternative energy sources, agriculture, and local production. And this is already bringing noticeable results. While the Venezuelan authorities continue to rely on oil, inflation is rising, living standards are falling, and unrest has naturally begun in the country. The crisis of the Venezuelan economy in the minds of people is strongly connected with the change of power, because when Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro became the new president, and exactly at the same time, the rapid decline of the economy and raising inflation began. But in fact, the prerequisites for this situation were even before the arrival of the new government. Let's take a look at the main points and key personalities of this story. This is Juan Vicente Gomez. Perhaps the fashion for dictatorship in Venezuela began with him. Gomez seized power by force in 1908, and to strengthen his position, he allowed foreign companies to extract Venezuelan oil. Yes, it was during his reign that the era of oil production in the country began, and I must say that he received a lot of money from this. By the end of his life in 1935, Gomez had become one of the richest men in Latin America. He created the country's first army to defend his power, cracked down on the opposition, and gave the government the right to take over all government revenues. Have the lives of Venezuelans improved at the same time, you ask? At first glance, yes. Remember at the beginning of the video we talked about the fact that the country's economy has grown and the people have more money? But it's hard to call it a working system, because the Bolivar exchange rate was inflated due to the active sale of oil, and all salaries and prices in the country were tied to this inflated rate. That is, the cost of living as a whole increased. By 1939, Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, had become one of the most expensive places to live in the world. Farmers left their lands and moved to cities to work in the oil industry. In addition, due to the growth of the Bolivar, it became unprofitable for people to buy local goods. Imported products became much more affordable, which is why local production stopped developing. And this trend was then observed by many subsequent presidents. And this is Isaias Medina Angarita. He was in power from 1941 to 1945. And he was also most worried about the oil sector. So a new oil law of 1943 was passed under him, which made oil production even more profitable for the state. And then the golden time for Venezuela began. Do you remember that after the Second World War, the demand for oil increased? The price per barrel also increased, and large amounts of money flowed into the country? However, against the backdrop of such large-scale revenues, people began to demand an increase in their incomes, and this was a serious problem. The Venezuelan military, which was very revolutionary, became more active, and as a result, Medina was simply removed from office, and the country was ruled by a civilian government. Then there were even attempts to establish democracy, but nothing good came of it. The country soon returned to the rule of a new dictator, Marcos Pérez Jiménez. He suppressed the opposition in every possible way, treated his political opponents cruelly, and rigged the election results in 1952. But despite this, the country's economy was growing at that time. Western companies were actively pouring into the country because there were few taxes and many consumers with money in their pockets. Admittedly, under Jimenez, the country really began to change. He began to invest in infrastructure, built highways, schools, hospitals, and public institutions. Corporations were provided with generous loans and subsidies, and Jimenez spared no money for the army. Why then did Venezuela not become as advanced and developed a country as Pérez wanted it to be? It seems that money alone was not enough for well-being. The infrastructure was put on display to impress foreigners, and all these large-scale projects were inevitably associated with waste, corruption, and bribery. State-owned enterprises simply lost money, and new facilities did not meet expectations. After that, Jimenez was also overthrown in 1958, and he promptly left the country. The Venezuelan economy found itself in a very strange situation. Lack of economic diversity, unemployment, food prices were set at low levels, which caused the agricultural sector to suffer. But the new Venezuelan government continued to focus on oil sales. Moreover, in 1960, the same oil-rich countries decided to unite and created the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. It includes the first 5 countries from the list of the richest in oil reserves. Those are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. But unfortunately, this also did not help Venezuela much to avoid the future crisis of the 1980s. At that time, power passed into the hands of the liberals. They tried to activate the market economy, carried out reforms, but it seemed simply impossible to get out of the crisis. And against the background of such total instability, a man came whose name will be remembered by many and whom we have already mentioned twice in this video, Hugo Chavez. Even a political ideology, Chavismo, appeared on the basis of his ideas. Since 2005, Chavez himself has defined his ideology as socialism of the 21st century. Although, if you think about it, he simply rolled back the reforms of the last government to the same total state control of oil production and income distribution. And in the 90s, the country's economy began to grow again, but again due to an increase in the price of oil. Hugo Chavez nationalized enterprises in key industrial sectors, created a system of local government, and implemented social programs that expanded public access to food, housing, healthcare, and education. And the standard of living in the country has really increased, but the economy was still tied to oil prices. And when the global crisis of 2008 occurred, Venezuelans again felt the instability of their situation. Demand for oil fell, the country's revenues decreased, but more importantly, the barrel continued to fall in price, which means that hard times have come for Venezuela again. By the end of Chavez's reign, the economic situation turned out to be extremely tense. Price controls and budget deficits only worsened the situation. The poverty rate increased, inflation also jumped, and then the commodity deficit began. Alas, it was not possible to build socialism. Hugo Chavez died of cancer in 2013, and the current president Nicolas Maduro came to power. And yet, what prospects does Venezuela have now? Is it possible to direct the economy of this country to stable growth? Well, it seems that Venezuela has not been able to get off the oil needle yet. The country's well-being is still directly dependent on oil prices. Oil money provides 95% of export revenues, more than 50% of the revenue of the state budget, and about 30% of GDP. At the same time, the volume of oil production, as well as its prices, are very unstable. Against the background of US sanctions, the state is suffering from hyperinflation, and the riots after the elections further increase tension in the country. But even in such a situation, there is a chance for improvement. There are rumors that the United States wants to lift sanctions on Venezuela in order to replace Russian oil with Venezuelan oil. And for Venezuela, this could be an opportunity for development. But it will again be dependent on oil, as well as on US decisions. Will these two states be able to find a common language when the United States recently called on Maduro to leave the presidency? And do you think America will take such a step? And is Venezuela ready to say goodbye to Hugo Chavez's ideas and focus on the US market? Write your thoughts in the comments down below.